They call it the system. A neat little word, sounds organized, safe, like a library filing cabinet or a Swiss train schedule. But strip away the marble columns of the Federal Reserve, peel back the freshly pressed suits of the Treasury secretaries, and what do you find? You don't find math, you don't find logic, you find a gun. We like to think money is real, that the $20 bill in your pocket has a soul, a weight, a promise attached to it, that if you work 40 hours, sweat through your shirt, and break your back, that piece of paper owes you something. That's the lie. That's the con. Because for the last 50 years, that paper hasn't been backed by gold. It hasn't been backed by silver, or grain, or the goodwill of the American people. It's been backed by a barrel of black sludge in the Arabian desert, and the screaming engines of an F-15 fighter jet. We're going to look at the crime scene, not the blood spatter on a sidewalk, but the ink stains on a treaty. The moment the United States decided that if it couldn't own the gold, it would own the oil. And in doing so, it would turn every other nation on earth into a junkie, hooked on the dollar, shivering and sweating for their next fix. But before the body hits the floor, you have to understand why the trigger was pulled. Rewind. Go back to when the American dream still had all its teeth. Post-World War II, the late 40s, the 50s. America is the only house on the block that isn't burning. Europe is rubble. Japan is ash. The British Empire is selling off the family silver just to keep the lights on, and sitting on top of the pile is the US dollar. Back then, it meant something. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, every dollar printed was a claim check. It whispered a promise. Bring me to the Treasury, and I will give you gold. Real gold. Heavy, cold, yellow metal, sitting in the dark at Fort Knox. It was an era of arrogance. We bought the world. We rebuilt it in our image. We flooded Europe with dollars to rebuild their factories, and in exchange they bought our Fords, our Coca-Cola, our steel. It was a beautiful loop, a perpetual motion machine of American dominance. Wall Street bankers walked with a swagger that cracked the pavement. They lit cigars in steakhouses, laughing at the idea of consequences. They thought the vault was bottomless, but greed makes you sloppy. By the mid-60s, the machine was overheating. We weren't just rebuilding Europe anymore. We were fighting a jungle war in Vietnam. We were launching men to the moon. We were building a welfare state at home called the Great Society. Guns and butter, that's what they called it. The politicians promised we could have both. Massive wars and massive comfort. But wars cost money. Rockets cost money. So the Federal Reserve did what counterfeiters do. They turned on the printing press. They printed more claim checks than there was gold in the vault. They diluted the supply. They watered down the whiskey. The rest of the world isn't stupid. The French saw it first. President Charles de Gaulle, that stubborn old general, looked at the pile of green paper accumulating in French banks and sneered. He knew it was fugazi, fairy dust. He did the one thing the US Treasury was terrified of. He called the bluff. De Gaulle sends the French Navy across the Atlantic, not to invade, but to collect. He wanted his gold. He parked his ships and said, "Take your dollars back. Give me the metal." Panic. Absolute, cold sweat panic in Washington. Other countries saw the French getting their gold and started lining up. Germany, Spain, Switzerland. They all showed up at the teller window with their hands out. The gold drained out of Fort Knox. You could hear the sucking sound from the Oval Office. By 1971, the vault was running on fumes. The US was bleeding out. If the run continued, America would be insolvent, bankrupt. The superpower would be just another deadbeat broke nation. August 15th, 1971, a Sunday night. Nixon hijacks the airwaves. He looks into the camera, eyes shifting, sweating under the hot studio lights. He tells the world he's temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, in forensic terms, this is the moment the suspect cuts the brake lines. The link was severed. The dollar was now just paper, fiat. It was backed by nothing but faith. And faith is a terrible currency when you're trying to buy oil from a king. Chaos followed. The dollar cratered. Inflation ripped through the American suburbs like a wildfire. Moms were paying double for milk. Dads were waiting in lines for gas that stretched 3 blocks. The stock market turned into a slaughterhouse. The illusion of stability shattered. The American century looked like it was ending after only 25 years. The men in the shadows, the Federal Reserve governors, the State Department strategists, the Wall Street vampires, they knew they needed a new anchor. They couldn't go back to gold. There wasn't enough of it, and they couldn't control it. They needed something the whole world needed, something essential, something that every nation, friend or foe, had to buy to survive. They looked at the map. They ignored the factories. They ignored the gold mines. They looked at the Middle East, specifically the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were sitting on the largest ocean of crude oil the world had ever seen, the lifeblood of the industrialized world. Without it, factories stop. Cars, stop. Tanks, stop. If the US could control the oil, they could control the money. But they had a problem. The Saudis hated us. Or rather, they hated our best friend, Israel. The 1973 oil embargo proved that. They turned off the tap, and the American economy had a stroke. The US needed a deal so sweet, so seductive, and so dangerous that the House of Saud couldn't refuse. July 1974, enter the fixer, William Simon, newly appointed Treasury Secretary, a bond trader from Salomon Brothers, a man with ice water in his veins and a mouth full of sharp teeth. President Nixon sends him on a diplomatic tour of Europe and the Middle East. That was the cover story. The press releases talked about cooperation and goodwill, garbage. The real mission was strictly off the books. Simon takes a flight to Jeddah. He has a briefcase and a mandate from the president. Don't come back without a deal. The terms were simple, brutal, and brilliant. The US would offer the Saudis total military protection. We would sell them the best weapons in our arsenal. We would guarantee the House of Saud stayed on the throne forever. We would wipe their enemies off the map. In exchange, the Saudis had to do 2 things. First, they had to use their massive oil profits to buy US Treasury bonds. They had to take the money we paid them and lend it right back to us, recycling the cash, propping up our debt. Second, and this is the kill shot, they had to price all their oil sales in US dollars, not German marks, not Japanese yen, not gold, only dollars. If France wanted oil, they had to buy US dollars first. If Brazil wanted oil, they had to buy US dollars first. It would create a permanent, artificial demand for the greenback. It would force the world to hold our money just to keep their lights on. Simon landed in the heat of the Saudi summer. He walked into the palace. No reporters, no cameras, just men in a room deciding the fate of the next century. He placed the offer on the table, the guarantee of survival for the royal family, in exchange for the economic enslavement of the world. The king looked at the contract. The silence in the room was heavy enough to crush a man's chest. Simon uncapped his pen. The ink on the Saudi contract wasn't even dry before the money started to move. And move is the wrong word. It didn't move. It flooded. Imagine a fire hose connected to a garden sprinkler. The price of oil quadrupled overnight. The Saudis were pumping black gold out of the ground, and the world was pumping green dollars back into the desert. They literally couldn't spend it fast enough. They bought gold-plated toilets. They bought fleets of Rolls-Royces. They built airports in the middle of nowhere. But the pile of cash just kept growing higher. This is where the mechanism kicks in. The invention that William Simon and the Wall Street boys cooked up. They called it petrodollar recycling. It sounds nice, responsible, like separating your plastics and your glass. It wasn't. It was a financial chokehold, a perpetual motion machine of debt. Here is how the machine worked. It's simple and it's sick. Step 1. The United States prints dollars. Step 2. We use those dollars to buy oil from the Saudis. Step 3. The Saudis take those same dollars and deposit them into US banks. Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America. Step 4. The US banks lend those dollars back to the US government to fund the deficit or to developing nations to buy American product. Do you see the circle? The money leaves America, takes a vacation in the Persian Gulf, and comes right back home to Wall Street. It's like a casino owner giving you chips to play. You lose the chips to the house. The house lends you the same chips back, but now you owe them interest. You play again, you lose again. You are trapped in the room, and the house owns your shoes, your watch, and your future. But for this to work, they needed secrecy, total darkness. Because if the world knew just how much of America the Saudis actually owned, the patriotism balloon would pop. If the average guy in Ohio knew his mortgage was effectively underwritten by a sheikh in Riyadh, there would be riots. So the Treasury created a special backdoor. It was an add-on facility at the Federal Reserve. Usually, when the US government sells debt, Treasury bonds, it's a public auction. Bidders shout numbers. It's transparent. Not for the Saudis. They were allowed to bypass the auction. They could buy as much debt as they wanted at the market price with zero competition and zero disclosure. No paper trail for the press. Just a wire transfer in the dark. It was a shadow book, a second set of ledgers. Why did they do it? Was it just greed? Sure, greed is always in the room, but this was about something more primal. Survival. The politicians in Washington, Nixon, Ford, Carter, they were addicts. They were addicted to spending money they didn't have. They wanted to wage the Cold War, build highways, and hand out subsidies, but they didn't have the guts to raise taxes. Taxing people makes them angry. Borrowing from them without them knowing. That's painless. This mechanism allowed the US to run massive deficits without the currency collapsing. We could write bad checks forever because the Saudis promised to never cash them. But there was a catch. The US banks, the middlemen, were now sitting on mountains of Saudi cash, deposits, billions of them. Bankers hate idle cash. Cash that isn't being lent is dead weight. It's a loss. They needed borrowers desperately. And since the US economy was stagnant, they looked south. Latin America, Africa, Asia. This is where the tragedy begins. This is the escalation. Bankers from New York flew down to Mexico City, Brasilia, Buenos Aires. They didn't go to help. They went to push product. The product was debt. They walked into the offices of dictators and generals, men in sunglasses who ran countries like personal piggy banks. The bankers slammed briefcases full of loan contracts on the mahogany tables. Here is $1 billion, they said. Build a dam, build a steel mill, build a palace. We don't care. Just take the money. There was one voice who tried to stop it. One man who saw the cliff edge. Not a politician, not a priest, a bureaucrat, Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve before the madness truly took hold. He was a pipe-smoking, academic, old school. He looked at the explosion of dollars, the recycling loop, and he saw the math. He warned that flooding the developing world with cheap loans was a suicide pact. He warned that these countries could never pay it back. He warned that the banks were overexposed. He was laughed out of the room. Countries don't go bust, said Walter Wriston. Wriston was the chairman of Citibank, the king of Wall Street. He was the smartest guy in the room, and he was dead wrong. He believed that because a country has land and people, it can always be squeezed for cash. So the loans flowed. Mexico took the bait. Brazil took the bait. Poland, Argentina, they borrowed billions to import oil priced in dollars and to buy American machinery priced in dollars. The trap was elegant. The loans were denominated in US dollars. And the interest rates, variable. That's the detail that kills you. It meant the payments weren't fixed. If the interest rates in the US went up, the payments for a steel mill in Brazil went up, but nobody worried. It was the late 70s. Money was cheap. Inflation was high, which made the debt seem smaller every year. The party was raging. The tequila was flowing in Mexico City, And the champagne was popping in Manhattan. Everyone was making money. The Saudis were rich. The banks were rich. The US government was funded. The dictators had their palaces. It was a perfect ecosystem of corruption. But a floating interest rate is a loaded gun. It's pointing at your head, and you're just hoping nobody touches the trigger. The trigger was in Washington, D.C. It was 1979. The inflation that the petrodollar system had helped create was now burning the house down. The US dollar was losing value so fast that shopkeepers were changing price tags twice a day. The system was shaking. To save the dollar, someone had to do the unthinkable. Someone had to stop the printing press. Paul Volcker, a giant of a man, 6'7", cigar smoke haloed around his bald head, walked into the Federal Reserve. He didn't care about the Saudis. He didn't care about the Mexican steel mills. He didn't care about Walter Wriston's bonuses. He put his hand on the lever. The world was drunk on cheap money, and Volcker was about to turn on the lights, smash the bottles, and lock the doors. He was about to raise interest rates, and he wasn't going to raise them a little bit. He was going to send them to the moon. It felt like a fever dream. The world was hallucinating. In New York, the disco balls were spinning and the cocaine was pure. In Mexico City, President Lopez Portillo stood on a balcony and told his people to prepare for administering the abundance. Abundance, that was the word of the hour. The oil money was infinite. The loans were infinite. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they weren't countries anymore. They were junkies with a platinum credit card. And Wall Street was the bartender pouring shots on the house. They built steel mills that produced nothing. They built highways that went nowhere. They bought private jets for their mistresses and stashed billions in Swiss accounts. Why not? Oil was going to hit $100 a barrel, maybe $200. The experts said so. The CIA said so. The banks said so. It was the new normal. A perpetual motion machine of debt and black gold. But in Washington, inside the stone fortress of the Federal Reserve, the mood wasn't euphoric, it was funereal. Paul Volcker sat in his office, surrounded by cheap cigar smoke. He looked at the inflation numbers. 11%, 13%, 14%. The dollar was dying. The currency that held the whole petrodollar scam together was rotting from the inside. If the dollar collapsed, the Saudis would stop taking it. If the Saudis stopped taking it, the American empire was over. Volcker had to choose. Save the American consumer or save the dollar? He chose the dollar. October 6th, 1979. A Saturday. The Saturday night special. Volcker walked into a press conference and dropped a nuclear bomb on the global economy. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't poll the public. He raised the rates. He tightened the money supply so hard the pipes screamed. Interest rates didn't just go up, they went vertical. 15%, 18%. By 1981, the prime rate hit 21.5%. Think about that mechanism we talked about, the floating interest rate, the trap. For 5 years, the developing world had borrowed billions at 5% or 6%. It was free money. Overnight, the cost of their mortgage tripled. Imagine you buy a house. Your payment is $1,000 a month. Totally manageable. Then, one morning, the bank calls. Good news, they say. Your payment is now $3,000. And next month, it might be $4,000. And by the way, you can't sell the house. Panic. In the finance ministries of Latin America, the color drained from their faces. The math didn't work anymore. The interest payments on the debt were now larger than their entire national income. They were insolvent, bankrupt, dead. But nobody said it out loud. Not yet. For almost 2 years, they lived in the extend and pretend. The Wall Street banks, Citibank, Chase, manufacturers Hanover, they saw the cliff. They knew the borrowers couldn't pay. If Mexico defaulted, the biggest banks in New York would be wiped out. Their capital would be gone. They would be dust. So what did they do? Did they confess? Did they take the loss? No, they doubled down. They lent Mexico more money to pay the interest on the old money. It's called a Ponzi scheme. When Bernie Madoff does it, he goes to prison. When Citibank does it, it's called liquidity management. They kept the party going. They kept booking the profits. They kept paying themselves bonuses on loans that were already rotting corpses. Walter Wriston, the king of Citibank, kept smiling for the cameras. Everything is fine, the suit said. The fundamentals are strong. It was a lie. A $1 trillion lie held together by handshake deals and fear. But you can't fight gravity forever. The oil price stopped rising. Then it started to slip. The income for the debtors dropped. The cost of the debt stayed sky high. The vice tightened. August 1982, the breaking point. Jesus Silva Herzog, the finance minister of Mexico, a smart man, a tired man. He looked at the ledger. The vaults in Mexico City were empty. Not low, empty. They had literally run out of dollars. They couldn't import food. They couldn't pay for parts for the factories. And they certainly couldn't pay the sharks in New York. He made a call to Washington. We need to talk. Friday the 13th, August 1982, Herzog flies to D.C. He walks into the U.S. Treasury. He sits across from the heavy hitters, the Fed, the Treasury Secretary, the IMF. The air conditioning is humming. The coffee is stale. Herzog doesn't blink. He drops the bomb. Mexico is turning out the pockets, he says. We owe you $80 billion. We have zero. On Monday morning, we default. The room went dead silent. This wasn't just about Mexico. If Mexico stopped paying, Brazil would stop. Argentina would stop. The Wall Street banks were leveraged 180% of their capital to these countries. If Herzog walked out of that room without a deal, on Monday morning, the ATM machines in New York would stop working. The checks would bounce. The global financial system would vaporize. The trap they had built for the world had just snapped shut on their own fingers. The Treasury officials looked at each other. They realized the terrifying truth. The US government was now the hostage. To save the banks, they would have to crush the people. Herzog leaned back in his chair. He wasn't asking for permission anymore. The problem, he whispered, is no longer ours. It's yours. The smoke cleared. The weekend in Washington ended. The men in suits shook hands. They wiped the sweat from their foreheads and ordered the limousines. They told the public they had saved the system. And they were right. They saved their system. The bailout wasn't a check written to Mexico. It was a check written to Citibank, to Chase, to Bank of America. The US government effectively guaranteed the bad loans. The banks got their money. The executives kept their bonuses. The shareholders kept their yachts. And the bill was sent to the poor. In Latin America, they call it La Década Perdida, the lost decade. To pay back the bankers in New York, entire nations were strip-mined. Schools were closed. Hospitals lost power. Food subsidies were slashed. Millions of people slid from poverty into starvation. It was an extraction operation, a transfer of wealth from the shanty towns of Rio de Janeiro to the penthouses of Manhattan. The lesson was learned, and it was the wrong lesson. Wall Street learned that they were invincible. They learned that if they gambled big enough and lost big enough, the taxpayer would step in. They learned that too big to fail was a license to kill. This was the birth of the New World Order, a world where finance isn't a servant of industry. It's the master, a world where you don't need to build cars or mine coal to get rich. You just need to be close to the money spigot. But look closely at the winner's circle. The ultimate winner wasn't just the banks. It was the dollar itself. By crushing the developing world, by forcing them to export everything they had just to get their hands on greenbacks to pay their debts, demand for the dollar skyrocketed. The petrodollar system was cemented in concrete. If you wanted to survive on this planet, you needed our paper. And for 40 years, that was the deal. We print, you work, we consume, you save. But every Ponzi scheme has a mathematical limit. Fast forward, look at the calendar. The cycle is closing. We are back at the crime scene. But this time, the victim isn't Mexico. It's us. Look at the numbers. They look familiar, don't they? The US debt is skyrocketing. Inflation is eating the middle class alive. The cost of living crisis. It's the same script as 1979, just with better special effects and smartphones. But there is one terrifying difference. In 1979, we had Paul Volcker. We had a man willing to crash the economy to save the currency. Today, there is no Volcker. The Federal Reserve is trapped. If they raise rates to fight inflation, they bankrupt the US government, which now owes more money than any entity in human history. If they print money to pay the debt, they destroy the dollar. They are in a box, and the walls are closing in, and the world knows it. The sharks smell blood. Remember the Saudis, the linchpin of the whole deal. The security for oil contract from 1974, it's dead. The Saudis are now selling oil to China, and they are accepting yuan. They are accepting gold. They are looking at the US dollar, that old frayed claim check, and they are saying, no thanks. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are building their own lifeboat. They are stacking gold. They are settling, trade in their own currencies. They are unplugging from the matrix. This is the de-dollarization you hear whispered about on the back pages of the financial press. It's not just a trend, it's a revolution. So what happens when the music stops this time? When the world sends our dollars back home, those trillions of dollars currently floating overseas, greasing the gears of global trade, they will come flooding back to American shores. It will be a tsunami of paper. And when it hits, the value of the money in your pocket, in your savings account, it will evaporate. The illusion of stability will shatter. But don't think for a second that the people in charge don't have a plan. They always have a plan. They won't go back to gold. Gold is too hard to control. You can hide gold under your mattress. You can trade it without permission. No, their solution will be the ultimate control. Central bank digital currency, programmable money. They will say it's for your safety. They will say it's convenient. They will say it fixes the inefficiencies of the old system. But here is the truth. It is a digital cage. If money is digital and controlled by the central bank, they can turn it off. Did you buy too much gas this month? Transaction declined. Did you donate to the wrong political candidate? Account frozen. Did you try to save your money instead of spending it to stimulate the economy? Negative interest rates applied. It is the perfection of the petrodollar scheme. In the old system, they forced nations to use their money. In the new system, they will force you to use their money. The extraction continues. But they don't need the Saudis anymore. They don't need the oil. They just need your compliance. The trap is set. The door is open, and they are waiting for us to walk in. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if you listen closely to the wind blowing through the canyons of Wall Street, you can hear the cage door slamming shut.